Picture this. You are crouched behind a marble column in the Vatican's most sacred halls. The air is heavy with incense, and with something far more intoxicating. The year is 1501, and through the shadows cast by flickering candelabras you witness what no eyes should ever see within these holy walls. The rustle of silk against stone mixes with laughter that echoes through corridors where saints once walked. Your heart pounds in your chest as you realize you're about to witness the most scandalous evening in papal history. An orgy so corrupt it would make even ancient Romans blush with shame. The October breeze drifts through the Vatican apartments carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts. But tonight these humble chestnuts will serve as props in a performance that will forever stain the church's reputation. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans prepare for a night that would later be recorded in a secret diary of Renaissance Rome, hidden away in the Vatican archives like a forbidden confession buried beneath centuries of prayers. Before we dive deeper into these lost stories of power and depravity, if you enjoy uncovering hidden truths of history, make sure to like and subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It amazes me that we can explore these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected by curiosity across time. The man remembered as the most perverse pope in history was born Rodrigo de Borja on January 1st, 1431, in the Spanish town of Játiva near Valencia. The dust of Spanish roads clung to his childhood, but destiny would carry him far beyond those humble beginnings into the marble corridors of Vatican power. His uncle, Alfonso de Borja, had already begun rising within the church, and when he became Pope Calixtus III in 1455, young Rodrigo's future was sealed like wax on a papal bull. At just 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal deacon, not through divine calling or spiritual devotion, but through nepotism, flowing through the church like poison in a dying body. He arrived in Rome, hungry for power, with ambition burning in his chest, ready to seize whatever opportunities the eternal city could offer. Rome in the late 15th century was a place of contradictions. By day, pilgrims knelt in devotion at gilded altars, their prayers rising like smoke to heaven. By night, the same streets became markets of flesh where fortunes were made. The papal court itself was a place where even salvation had a price tag written in gold ducats. Rodrigo understood this world better than anyone. He accumulated wealth with the precision of a spider weaving its web, gathering church benefices across Europe like a merchant hoarding jewels. His lifestyle was that of a Renaissance prince rather than a servant of God. Lavish banquets, opulent palaces, and a string of mistresses who bore him children as regularly as the harvest. The most important of these relationships was with Vanozza Catanei, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty matched her political cunning. Between 1474 and 1482, she gave Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Jofre. Each child was placed like a chess piece in Rodrigo's grand game of power, their lives sacrificed to his ambition. Even as a cardinal, his behavior scandalized Rome, a city already drowning in scandal. In 1460, Pope Pius II wrote him a scathing letter condemning his conduct in Siena that had shocked the entire town. But Rodrigo had no room for shame. He was determined to win the papacy, and morality was nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. The conclave of August 1492 unfolded like a carefully staged dance of corruption behind closed doors in the Sistine Chapel, beneath what would later become Michelangelo's masterpiece. 23 cardinals gathered to choose the next vicar of Christ. Gold passed from hand to hand, promises were whispered like prayers, and high offices were traded as easily as communion wafers. When the smoke cleared on August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, his victory openly attributed to simony, the buying and selling of holy office. To the surprise of many, Rome celebrated. The people had grown used to their Spanish cardinal, and they expected a reign of magnificence and strength. Bonfires lit the 7 hills, torchlight processions wound through the ancient streets, and triumphal arches rose in his honor. His coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on August 26th was greeted with what contemporaries called the greatest ovation ever given to a pope. Alexander VI began with reforms that seemed promising. He restored order in Rome, where more than 200 murders had taken place in the months before his election. He divided the city into districts, placed magistrates in charge of keeping peace, and even held open hearings every Tuesday to hear complaints, earning praise for his efficiency. For a moment, it seemed divine providence had chosen the right man for the throne of St. Peter. But power, like wine, doesn't create character, it reveals it. Alexander's initial reforms were soon eclipsed by his obsession with elevating his children, especially his sons, Juan and Cesare. Juan was made Duke of Gandia in Spain and married into royal blood, while Cesare, barely 18, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia and elevated to a cardinal, treating each sacred title as a stepping stone toward greater power. The papal apartments during Alexander's reign became a stage where the sacred and profane performed an obscene ballet. Dinners stretched late into the night, accompanied by entertainment that tested the limits of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella for her extraordinary beauty, moved through the Vatican corridors as freely as any cardinal. Her presence was a constant reminder that the Pope's spiritual vows had been crushed beneath earthly desires. Johann Burchard entered this world of contradictions as a meticulous observer armed with a quill and an unforgiving memory. Born around 1450, this priest studied canon law and climbed the ecclesiastical ranks to become papal master of ceremonies, a position granting him intimate access to the Vatican's most private moments. Beginning in 1483 under Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard maintained what he called his Liber Notarum, a detailed diary recording both magnificent ceremonies and the scandalous behavior of 5 popes. Burchard was no romantic. He had the soul of an accountant and the eye of a court stenographer. His writings lacked the flourishes of contemporary chroniclers but carried the weight of truth because of their dry, matter-of-fact tone. He recorded papal ceremonies with the same attention to detail he gave to scandals, creating a documentary record that would eventually make even hardened Vatican archivists uneasy. The Master of Ceremonies held a unique position within the papal hierarchy. He was neither high enough to take part in corruption nor low enough to be excluded from witnessing it. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, he moved through the Vatican's private spaces, observing everything while appearing insignificant. Cardinals confided in him about ceremonial matters and forgot his presence during moments requiring discretion. This invisibility became his greatest asset as a chronicler of papal vice. By the late 1490s, the Borgia family's behavior had begun attracting negative attention throughout Europe. Alexander's eldest son, Juan, had become Duke of Gandia, but his character was as corrupt as his title was undeserved. Stories circulated of his cruelty, sexual excesses, and incompetence as a military commander. The golden heir of the Borgia dynasty was becoming a liability even his devoted father could not ignore. The events of June 14, 1497 changed everything. Juan's body was discovered floating in the Tiber River, his throat cut and his body bearing 9 wounds. The murder sent shockwaves through Rome and struck Alexander with grief so profound that observers wondered if divine justice had finally visited the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights the Pope refused food and sleep, weeping behind closed doors like a broken man rather than the mighty pontiff who had once intimidated kings. In his anguish, Alexander announced a program of church reform. He called for measures to restrain the luxury of the papal court, reorganize the apostolic chancery, and suppress simony and concubinage. For a brief moment, it seemed that personal tragedy might accomplish what years of criticism had failed to achieve. A commission of cardinals and canonists began drafting ordinances that anticipated the reforms of the Council of Trent still decades in the future. But grief, like everything else in Alexander's character, proved temporary. Within months, the reform proposals were forgotten, filed away like embarrassing love letters from youth. The Pope's attention turned to his surviving children, particularly Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition would now drive the family's agenda. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was his sword, sharp, cold, and utterly without conscience. Cesare possessed a magnetism that drew both admirers and enemies. Tall, handsome, and nearly a genius in intelligence, he had originally been destined for the church like his father, but his talents lay in warfare and statecraft rather than theology. In 1498, he resigned his cardinalship, becoming the first cardinal in history to voluntarily abandon the sacred office and pursue secular power. Italy's political landscape offered Cesare opportunities that would have challenged even Machiavelli's imagination. King Louis XII of France needed papal approval to annul his marriage, and Italian duchies stood vulnerable to conquest by a sufficiently ruthless commander. Alexander saw these circumstances as a chance to create a kingdom for his son, even if it meant allying with foreign powers against fellow Italians. Through siege warfare, assassination, and political manipulation, Cesare carved out a domain in central Italy, becoming one of the most powerful men in Europe. His methods were so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli later used him as the model for the prince, admiring Cesare's ability to combine cruelty with efficiency in pursuit of political goals. But such success required resources that even papal coffers could not easily provide, leading Alexander to increasingly creative methods of fundraising. The sale of indulgences, church offices, and even cardinals' hats became systematic during Alexander's later years. Wealthy families could purchase ecclesiastical positions for their sons, effectively buying salvation along with social status. The College of Cardinals expanded not through spiritual merit but through financial contribution, as Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals during his reign, Each appointment brought thousands of ducats into the papal treasury and ultimately into Cesare's war chest. Rome at this time resembled a city under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgia family treated the papal states as their personal kingdom, with Alexander as patriarch and Cesare as crown prince. Lucrezia, despite later attempts to rehabilitate her reputation, was used as a political pawn in marriage alliances that served family interests rather than her own happiness. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled on grounds. After political circumstances changed, Lucrezia was quickly remarried to Alfonso of Biscaglie, who was later murdered, possibly on Cesare's orders, when the alliance no longer served Borgia interests. During these years, the Vatican apartments became a stage for increasingly elaborate entertainments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander delighted in theatrical performances, musical concerts, and dinner parties that stretched deep into the night. Guests included cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and a selection of courtesans whose beauty was matched only by their discretion, or lack thereof. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond simple amusement. They demonstrated papal wealth and power, offered opportunities for political negotiation, and tested loyalty among Alexander's supporters. Cardinals who joined the Pope's entertainments were implicated in his behavior, making them reluctant to criticize or betray him. Those who refused invitations marked themselves as potential enemies, vulnerable to the same retribution that had struck so many of the Borgia family's opponents. By the autumn of 1501, the Borgias were at the height of their power and perhaps their corruption. Cesare had completed his conquest of the Romagna, earning praise from military observers across Europe. Alexander had survived multiple political crises, including Charles VIII's invasion and ongoing rivalries with noble families. The Jubilee year of 1500 had brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling both the papal treasury and the city's brothels with equal enthusiasm. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and moral decay that Cesare conceived what would become known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The precise motivation for the event remains unclear: celebration, political theatre, or the logical peak of years of outrageous behaviour. Contemporary sources offer different explanations but agree on the essential facts that would shock even seasoned observers of papal vice. October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve, was traditionally considered the night when the boundary between the sacred and profane was thinnest. Whether the date was chosen deliberately or coincidental, it became the stage for the most infamous papal orgy in history. On a night meant to honour the dead, the Borgia family was poised to obliterate whatever dignity remained in the papacy. Lucrezia's apartments in the Vatican, part of the papal palace magnificently decorated by Pinturicchio during Alexander's early years, provided the setting. Frescoes depicted scenes from classical mythology and Christian history, creating an ironic backdrop for events that belonged to neither tradition. What had been designed to showcase the Pope's wealth and cultural sophistication instead became the stage for an evening epitomizing all the criticisms leveled against the family. The guest list revealed the extent of Borgia corruption. Cardinals who should have been at prayer mingled with Roman nobles whose wealth had bought their silence about previous scandals. Diplomats from across Europe attended, either to gather intelligence on papal intentions or simply out of curiosity to see how far the Borgias would stretch acceptable behaviour. The true stars, however, were the 50 courtesans Cesare assembled to entertain the guests. These were not street prostitutes, but sophisticated women who understood how to provide pleasure while maintaining discretion required by powerful men. Many had previous experience at papal entertainments, knowing the rules and rewards for satisfying influential patrons. Johann Burchard, as master of ceremonies, was present that evening, not as a participant, but as an observer. His duties required him to attend any ceremonial functions, even during private entertainments. This role placed him perfectly to witness and record events that others might have preferred to forget. His account, written in Latin with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner, preserves details of both the evening and the wider moral climate of Alexander's papacy. According to Burchard, the evening began conventionally with dinner in Cesare's private chambers. The meal featured seasonal delicacies appropriate to the guests' social status, accompanied by wines from the papal cellars, carefully aged in Roman caves. Conversation flowed alongside the wine, touching on politics, military campaigns, and artistic patronage, allowing attendees to demonstrate both sophistication and cultural refinement. As servants cleared the tables, the evening's true entertainment began. The 50 courtesans, dressed in silks and velvets chosen to highlight their physiques, began to dance for the assembled guests. Musicians, sworn to secrecy, played rhythms that encouraged increasingly intimate movement. What followed tested even the wide definitions of acceptable behavior established during Alexander's papacy. Burchard recorded with precise detail. The women initially danced fully clothed, but as wine flowed and the night progressed, garments were gradually discarded until the entertainers performed entirely nude. The N's formation occurred slowly enough for guests to adjust, but clearly enough that none could claim ignorance of the evening's direction. The centerpiece of the entertainment involved the chestnuts that gave the banquet its name. Servants removed the candelabras from the tables and placed them on the floor, creating pools of flickering light separated by shadows. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the nude courtesans crawled on hands and knees to collect them, their bodies illuminated by candlelight as they moved through the improvised obstacle course. Pope Alexander VI, according to Burchard, watched these. The proceedings were observed from a seat of honor by Pope Alexander, accompanied by Cesare and Lucrezia. The presence of the Pope's daughter at such an event has puzzled historians for centuries. Was she a willing participant in family corruption or a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Contemporary sources offer conflicting interpretations, but all agree that she was present as the evening reached its climax of degradation. The final phase of the entertainment involved competitions among the male guests to see who could achieve sexual relations with the greatest number of courtesans. Prizes were offered: silk tunics, shoes, berets, and other luxury items of significant value in an era when such goods were mostly handmade. The competitions were conducted publicly, with servants keeping score, transforming intimate human interaction into a spectacle for papal amusement. Burchard's account of these events was preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, sealed from public view for centuries. When Pope Leo XIII opened the archives to researchers in the late 19th century, he expressed particular reluctance to allow access to documents that might damage Alexander VI's reputation. The need for such caution more than 4 centuries later underscores the enduring power of the scandal Burchard had carefully documented. The morning after the banquet of chestnuts, Rome appeared unchanged on the surface, but its spiritual foundations were fundamentally altered. Pilgrims continued to arrive for Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinals maintained their schedules of meetings and ceremonies, and the Pope himself appeared in public as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet word of the previous evening's event spread among servants, guards, and minor officials who had witnessed or heard about the papal orgy. The scandal reached beyond Rome through diplomatic correspondence, whose letters preserved in European archives detail the shock and disgust of observers who had considered themselves immune to surprise regarding papal behavior. Even representatives of secular rulers, accustomed to moral flexibility in their own courts, expressed amazement at what had transpired within the sacred precincts of the Vatican. The political implications extended beyond personal morality. Reformers across Europe, including figures like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, seized upon reports of the banquet as evidence that the papacy had become irredeemably corrupt. Calls for church councils to depose Alexander VI gained new urgency, supported by detailed accounts that seemed to confirm the worst accusations against the Borgia Pope. Alexander's response to criticism was characteristically defiant. Rather than expressing remorse or implementing reforms, he intensified his support for Cesare's military campaigns and continued to live in the magnificent excess that had defined his entire papacy. If anything, the scandal seemed to free him from any restraints that had previously limited his behavior, as if public acknowledgement of his corruption eliminated the need for even superficial respectability. The banquet of chestnuts occurred near the end of Alexander's papacy, but it was not an isolated incident of moral failure. Instead, it represented the logical culmination of years of steadily escalating corruption that had transformed the papal court into something unrecognizable to earlier generations of Christian believers. Sacred and profane had become so intertwined that distinguishing between them required an effort few were willing to make. Cesare's career continued to flourish immediately after the scandal, showing that moral outrage had little impact on political calculations in Renaissance Italy. His military successes continued to earn praise from observers who admired effectiveness regardless of the character of those who achieved it. Machiavelli later analyzed Cesare's methods, explicitly separating political skill from moral virtue, arguing that successful rulers must employ any means necessary to achieve their ends. However, success built on such foundations proved temporary. Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503, possibly from malaria, though rumors of poisoning reflected the atmosphere of suspicion and violence that had marked his reign. His death had immediate consequences for his children. Cesare lost political support without papal protection and died fighting as a common mercenary in Spain 4 years later. Lucrezia survived to become Duchess of Ferrara, but her later life was overshadowed by the scandals of her youth and her family's notorious reputation. The new Pope, Julius II, refused to occupy the Borgia apartments where the banquet of chestnuts had taken place. He moved to rooms on the floor above, commissioning Raphael to decorate them with frescoes that would become some of the most celebrated artworks in Vatican history. This physical relocation symbolized a broader attempt to distance the papacy from the moral failures of Alexander's reign. Though repairing the papal reputation proved more difficult than redecorating apartments, historical assessments of the banquet of chestnuts have varied according to the moral and political climate of subsequent eras. Catholic historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries often disputed Burchard's account, arguing that no reliable witness could have documented such extreme behavior, or that later interpolations had corrupted the text. Protestant historians embraced the scandal as evidence supporting criticisms of papal authority and Catholic moral claims. Modern historians generally accept the basic accuracy of Burchard's account, placing it in the broader context of Renaissance Italian culture. They note that sexual displays and public entertainments involving prostitutes were not uncommon among secular rulers of the period, making Alexander's behavior shocking primarily because of his position as head of the Catholic Church, rather than because such conduct was unknown in contemporary society. The architectural setting of the banquet adds another layer of historical irony. The rooms where the orgy occurred had been decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes depicting episodes from classical mythology and Christian history. Ancient gods and saints looked down from the painted walls as events unfolded that would have scandalized both pagan and Christian sensibilities, creating a visual. Commentary often highlights the distance between artistic ideals and human reality. Archer. Eological studies of the Vatican apartments reveal details about the physical layout that help explain how such events could occur within the papal palace. The Borgia apartments were designed with multiple chambers connected by corridors, allowing both public ceremonies and private entertainments. Soundproofing between rooms ensured that activities in one area might not be heard in adjacent spaces, providing the privacy necessary for Alexander's increasingly extreme behavior. The preservation of Burchard's diary in the Vatican's secret archives raises questions about the Church's relationship with its own history. For centuries, these documents remained sealed, accessible only to a handful of researchers with special permission from papal authorities. The decision to maintain such records while restricting access suggests recognition of their historical importance, coupled with embarrassment over their contents. Contemporary accounts beyond Burchard provide corroborative evidence for at least some version of the events. Diplomatic correspondence from the period references papal entertainments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. While few sources give the explicit details that make Burchard's account so compelling, the convergence of multiple sources pointing to similar conclusions strengthens the case for accepting the basic historicity of the Banquet of Chestnuts. The scandal's impact on subsequent papal history cannot be measured solely in immediate political terms. Alexander VI's behavior, culminating in events like the banquet, provided ammunition for Protestant reformers who argued that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. Martin Luther's criticisms gained credibility from well-documented examples of moral failure at the highest levels of church hierarchy. The Counter-Reformation, which began in the mid-16th century, was in part a response to scandals like the banquet. Church leaders recognized that moral reform was necessary to restore papal credibility and counter Protestant criticisms. The Council of Trent's emphasis on clerical discipline and the establishment of seminaries for priestly education addressed problems dramatically illustrated by Alexander VI's conduct. Reform, however, came at a cost beyond policy changes. The Baroque magnificence of post-Tridentine papal ceremonies sought to restore dignity to papal authority through visual splendor and carefully choreographed ritual. The spontaneous entertainments that had characterized Alexander's court were replaced by formal presentations, emphasizing papal majesty while minimizing opportunities for scandal. The psychological impact of events like the Banquet of Chestnuts on participants and observers remains difficult to assess. For the courtesans who performed, the evening likely represented professional obligation rather than personal degradation. Their social position made such employment a matter of economic necessity rather than moral choice. Church officials who attended may have participated willingly or complied reluctantly, aware that refusing could carry professional repercussions. The broader Roman population's response reveals the complex relationship between religious authority and popular faith. Despite widespread awareness of Alexander's moral failures, pilgrims continued to flock to Rome, masses continued, and the sacramental system functioned. Popular Catholicism had developed sufficient theological sophistication to distinguish between the personal worthiness of officials and the validity of their religious functions. The Banquet of Chestnuts represents more than an isolated incident of papal misconduct. It illuminates the broader transformation of Renaissance Italy from medieval Christendom to the early modern European state system. Alexander VI's behavior reflected the values of secular princes who used luxury and spectacle to demonstrate power, but his position as spiritual leader of Catholic Christianity created contradictions that proved unsustainable. The evening of October 31st, 1501, stands as a watershed moment in papal history, when the tension between spiritual authority and temporal power reached a crisis demanding resolution. The scandal forced subsequent popes to choose between worldly magnificence and moral credibility, shaping the development of the Catholic Church for centuries. Looking back over 5 centuries, the candlelit evening in the Vatican apartments reflects humanity's eternal struggle between sacred aspirations and profane desires. The chestnuts scattered across marble floors became symbols of how far human dignity can fall when power escapes moral constraint. In a world where such contrasts still exist, where spiritual leaders sometimes fail their followers, and where power corrupts even those called to serve higher purposes, the banquet of chestnuts serves as both historical scandal and enduring warning. The candles that illuminated that notorious evening have long since burnt out. The participants have long since returned to dust, and the rooms now display priceless artworks for reverent tourists. Yet Burchard's careful Latin preserves those moments when the boundary between sacred and profane collapsed entirely, when the Vicar of Christ became indistinguishable from the most dissolute Roman emperor, and when chestnuts on marble floors bore witness to the distance between human ambition and divine calling. Ultimately, the significance of Alexander VI's Forbidden Orgy lies not just in individual moral failure, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both transcendence and degradation. The same species that built soaring cathedrals and created sublime religious art also gathered in papal chambers to witness spectacles challenging spiritual authority. The chestnuts were gathered before dawn, yet the questions they raise about power, faith, and human nature continue to scatter across history, waiting for each generation to interpret the legacy left by the most perverted pope who ever claimed the keys to heaven.